Okay, so we had that interruption. Sorry about that. Well, sorry. It's a pity that that happened because I want to try to keep us going so that we get to the meditations still in the order that I have on the syllabus, right? So I might have to compress a bit today and do a bit more talking than I would normally like to do to get us along. So if we get most of Meditation 3 done today, great. The part that we probably won't get to is the business of showing or proving that God isn't deceptive. But I wanted to start out by pointing out that just when you thought, after writing those assignments, that you were finally in the clear and that you thought, great, now I've got something that I can be certain about and I can move on to proving the existence of other things apart from myself and my thoughts, Descartes drags you back into the quicksand of doubt again. So I'm just going to telegraph that he's doing that and come back next week to an attempt to get out of this. So very quickly, people who wrote that he argued that I could be certain that I am thinking and I can be certain that I exist, at least at the moment that I am thinking, I can be certain that I'm thinking, and at the moment that I'm thinking, I can be certain that I exist, right? People who wrote that he argued that were correct, except that in the third meditation, he raises the worry once again. So remember, the assignment was, why did he think that he could doubt things like 2 + 3 = 5 and a square has four sides, so that he couldn't doubt I am thinking, right? What would be the kind of doubt that I would raise about those? It would be something like, well, they seem true to me, but maybe the evil demon could be duping me or fooling me into thinking that's true, and in fact that's false. And when you get to this one, here would be the kind of question, why can't a deceiving God, because that's what he wants to talk about now, it's the demon is kind of as a hypothesis has been removed, and he's now getting into the question of an actually existing God and whether that's going to be a deceiving God. Why can't a deceiving God deceive me into thinking I think, or I am thinking, when I am not thinking? Now, all of you were correct to argue that that just seems incoherent. We all agree that just looks incoherent, right? Deceives me into thinking I think when I am not thinking. How can I be thinking when I am not thinking, right? That seems just a contradiction. So, the trouble is, it's a contradiction to deny that, and it's a contradiction to deny that. And what Descartes isn't revealing to you at this point in the meditations, because he doesn't reveal it ever in the actual meditations, you have to go and read his other stuff, is that he actually thinks that God creates all truths, including the truths of mathematics. This is the famous eternal truths doctrine, that that's not true until God makes it so. And that's not true until God makes it so. Therefore, it seems, that's not true unless God makes it so. And that just undermines the idea that, as it were, there's such a thing as a contradictory statement. As it were, contradictory statements are made contradictory because God decides that they're contradictory, not because they actually are contradictory. So I'm going to just warn you that although it seems this is secure, what Descartes says in Meditation 3 is he can't even be secure of the cogito unless he can show that gods don't deceive. So I'm just telling you that I don't believe it's a particularly good argument because, as we've worried about since the beginning, how can he end up proving something about God's not being a deceiver if he's worried that he can't prove anything? I mean, it's going to be the problem of whether he's in a circle when he tries to prove that God is not a deceiver. So I'm going to signpost that he raises a doubt about the cogito in the meditation 3, but I'm not going to discuss the doubt until Tuesday. Today, I'm going to assume, for the sake of the argument, that we are confident about this one, at the very least. Right? And as people wrote, insofar as at the moment that I think I am thinking, right, that must be true. And at the moment that I'm thinking, it is going to be true also that I exist, right? Then it seems that we have some examples of truths that I am certain of. One or two quick things from what people wrote. What people wrote was very good in general, or I was just too soft on them, I haven't decided, but whichever it is, you guys came out okay. Note, I exist is not the same thing as I am alive. Think about that for a second. We know that things can exist without being alive, right? That chair, even though Descartes hasn't proven it yet, that chair exists, and it's not alive. But let me ask you, if a soul exists, is a soul alive? Is a soul living? Does anybody think a soul is alive? Yeah?
Well, the soul is kind of the counterpart of the body, and the body is alive, and the soul is kind of... It exists,
yeah.
it doesn't really have that property at all. Like
Of life?
I guess so. Don't you say that when you die, the soul kind of goes somewhere else?
I'm not disagreeing with anything that you said, and I'm not yet agreeing, but the proposition is souls aren't alive or over the opposite of being alive?
Not alive.
Souls aren't alive or dead, only bodies are alive or dead. Is this step to this?
Yeah, well, I think if you have a soul, then you have to be alive. I mean, Descartes thinks of like...
Okay, let me ask you this. You have to be alive, you said, right? Do angels have souls?
I would think so.
Do gods have souls?
Yeah.
Are they alive?
Well, yeah. I don't know. I mean, they are probably just without a physical body.
Oh, but wait a second. The point is the meaning of alive might have to be what?
Having a physical body.
It's not clear that alive can be applied to things like souls if they don't have the qualities of death versus alive, or living versus dead. If that's true, then God wouldn't be said to be living. Existing, but not living, because they don't. Now, I'm not saying that Descartes has a theory about this, but don't assume that because something exists, even a soul exists, that you can say a soul is alive. You may actually not want to say that. You may want to say the body is alive and the soul exists. Yeah?
Couldn't it be said that a soul is alive and that without a soul isn't? So the angels are alive, God is alive, because and that they are souls, but people, we have souls, so we're alive. Animals may or may not have souls. That chair doesn't have a soul. It's not alive.
I'm agreeing that Descartes wants to be very, very, very particular about which things have souls or are souls. Maybe God is a soul rather than has a soul. There's a debate about the meaning of that. But my thought is, life and death seem to make sense in relation to each other. And if souls don't have, as it were, death, what souls have are existence and non-existence. And so it might be that we shouldn't use the language of life and consequently of death to anything other than living organisms or organisms. So if we think of it as organisms are alive or dead, then souls are not organisms. And so we have to say that life or death attaches to bodies, not to souls. Now, I'm not saying that Descartes has a theory about that, but that's something that people shouldn't assume just because you've got the proof. So you can prove that you exist. It's not clear you can prove you're alive if you don't yet prove you've a body. You might be better than alive. You exist. It might be better than being alive, right? Okay, so I just want to make that quick point. Okay, so existence meaning that you are rather than are not. There was still one other worry people have. What about the I? We worried about the fact that there could be thoughts perhaps without substances. People said, well, that seems crazy. But one thing that was raised is, what if you think you're somebody else from who you are? Right? So anybody's watched Total Recall? I think I'm this worker in this factory, but actually I'm a secret government spy or something, right? You know, could you think that you were Napoleon Bonaparte? I exist. Who am I? I'm Napoleon Bonaparte. Seems like you could have false beliefs about who you are in some sense. So Descartes doesn't have to prove that you are who you think you are. He only has to prove that you are someone, or there is someone existing. That he doesn't have to prove in the end that he's Renee. He might be Margaret thinking that he's Renee, but there's someone thinking that she is Renee. And that's all that he needs for that argument to go through. He doesn't need to prove he's Renee, he just needs to prove. And finally, when you guys look at I am thinking, your point is not to say that it's true that Descartes exists or that Descartes is existing. This is something that you take on yourself. So when you are agreeing with Descartes, you're not agreeing that Descartes exists. You're agreeing that you exist when you say, I exist. So you're proving your own existence with the cogito, not Descartes' existence. You take on the I when you read the cogito to prove your own existence. But as I said, your own existence is minimal. A, not necessarily you're alive, you exist. And B, not necessarily who you think you are, but you're someone. And that's why some people raise the objection, what about if the entire universe was like the Borg or something, right? On the Borg, the collective consciousness. Okay, true of Star Trek reference. But if it's the case that the whole universe was kind of one mind, and it wasn't individual minds, just one big mind, it would still be the case that it would be true that it, whatever that one mind was, existed. Even if portions of the consciousness thought that they were James or John or Jeff or Mary, it would still be true that that one consciousness at the very least existed. Okay, so that's why it's pretty minimal, the cogito. But let's assume for the sake of the argument that we do think there's something that we have established here. What he now says is that insofar as I am confident of the truth of these statements, I am thinking and I exist, I am existing if you like, he now says, okay, we can extract from that, since we got these results, we can figure out how do I know that these are truths? What is it that I have that enables me to establish truths? And what he says is he has a rule. As I said, this rule is still going to have to be in the end substantiated by an argument for why there's no deceiving God. But the rule is the truth rule, or the truth and clarity rule. I just call it, sorry, the distinctness and clarity rule. I just call it the truth rule. And the truth rule is, very simply, whatever I clearly and distinctly perceive, right, to be true, if you want to add that, is true. Now, in the meditation, he doesn't say an awful lot about what it means to clearly and distinctly perceive something to be true. He says something later on in his later work, that the principles, that it means having something before your mind without any, as it were, lack of clarity. So some kind of clear thought before your mind, and no other thoughts before your mind except that thought. That was the distinctly part. Now that, for most people, is just repeating himself, so it doesn't really clarify much. But the idea, I think, is this. When you clearly think about those numbers, and I'm going to use this as an example because I think in the end he has to try to justify these ones. When you think clearly about the concepts of 2 and 3 and plus and addition and 5, you must in the end conclude that that's correct, that that couldn't possibly be false. When you think clearly about I am thinking, at least when you concentrate on the fact that there's thought occurring, it can't be the case that there's thought occurring and there's nothing existing to have thought. That's just clear to your mind. But it's important that you now understand that what you're getting with the truth rule, right, is your own certainty about things being true. So things are true, as we established at the very beginning of the course, regardless of what you think. There are things that are true and there are things that are false, regardless of what you think. But this is the power to get knowledge of the truth, to just apply that rule to your thoughts. Now, really what it means is if you can think of a reason to doubt it, and think of a reason that it could be false, then you can't be certain as to its truth. Now, it's important that we see the truth rule tells you, as it were, what you can arrive at. So it's really just saying, be very, very jealous and careful. Right? You only want to arrive at truths. There might be a bunch of things that are true, right? X, Y, and Z. And these might be very, very complicated things. And you don't know in advance which ones are true. So scrutinize each one. And maybe this one is really, really clear and distinct, and you're going to say yes. And maybe this one is fuzzier. And it's not that you know that it's not true, or you know that it's false. You're not sure, because it's not clear and distinct enough in your mind. So if it's not clear and distinct enough in your mind, you should just leave it. So analyze each candidate for truth. If it's clear and distinct to your mind, you can go ahead and believe it. If it's not completely clear and distinct, if you're worried that it might not be true, leave it. It doesn't mean it's false. It just means you can't be certain of it, and you have to leave it. So long as people understand the difference in saying, I know this is false, no, and I'm puzzled about it. So let's say, even though I think this is wildly in advance of anything Descartes has argued, let's say that this one is something like, what? Life on other planets. Now, you might think there just can't be life on other planets. I don't know that anybody is that clear and distinct about that. I think that most people are open to the possibility. But it may be that we just don't know enough about life to know that there can't be life on other planets. Maybe science will eventually tell us there can't be life on other planets. Right now, we just can't be absolutely confident, right, that there is or that there isn't. So we're going to basically leave it as we don't know if there's life on other planets. Right? But I suppose we think that truths of mathematics, even though Descartes is going to worry about them, we're not going to worry about them in this class ourselves. Truth of mathematics, we think, yeah, we can be pretty confident about those ones. Right? Yeah. And of course, what about things that we clearly and distinctly believe to be not true? Although we don't talk much about that, that's also the case, right? So that means that 2 plus 3 equals 6. We know that's false. So remember, those are your options. You can clearly see it to be false, which is really the flip side of you clearly see something to be true, and something's just unclear. So if it's unclear, leave it. It doesn't mean it's false. We don't know. It could be true. It could be false. We don't know. We have to leave it alone. Maybe come back to it after a couple more centuries of... I suppose I gave, as an example at the beginning of the term, Goldbach's conjecture in mathematics is still something that people have a question mark about. They believe it to be certain that the sum of, and what it is, the sum of the two primes. Anyway, the point is, it's a conjecture, as yet we haven't proven it, so we leave it as a question mark, right? Fermat's last theorem was a conjecture until Andrew Wiles up in Princeton proved it eventually to be true. So that's what you're after. And that's pretty hard to prove that one. That took Andrew, I think, 7 years plus another couple after the first problem was posed for it. Okay, now, to go back to meditation 3 from understanding the truth rule, we now want to say what he thinks he has to do is validate the truth rule, which again is, oh my God, really? We have to go back to validating the truth rule? And so what he says is what he needs to do is to show that there is no deceiving God. So now we know that Descartes' project is the rather minor project of proving the existence of God. And let's just explain this more generally. There are in philosophy, traditionally, 4 proofs. If they succeed, they're proofs. They're arguments until they succeed, right? 4 arguments for the people who make them proofs for the existence of God. One is, and I'll just explain them after I write them. So ontological argument. This is one that we'll meet with, right, in meditation 5, by the way. It's coming. The other one is the cosmological argument. We're actually going to have that today. That's the, it's his variation anyways on the cosmological argument, meditation 3. The third one is something called the teleological argument. And that's something that we don't get in the meditations. But you can find it in a certain way, you can find it in Berkeley later on in this course. It's a very curious form of an argument from Berkeley, because Berkeley thinks that the world is not physically real, but it's just a collection of ideas, and he says God can be inferred from the order and harmony of those ideas. And then the last one is something called the moral argument. And that's one that we won't deal with in this course actually at all, and that comes from Kant. And if you do Kant's philosophy of religion, or even just if you do Kant's metaphysics, you might get taught the moral argument for God's existence. So let me just explain them very quickly, and then we look at the one that's Descartes' one today in meditation 3. The ontological argument is the argument that says we can show or prove that God exists just by thinking about God's nature. And very quickly, because we'll spend a whole day on it, this argument is something like the following. God must exist because God is God, and God's all-powerful, and God has all properties and perfections. And existence is a property or a perfection. So God would be imperfect if God didn't exist. So if God's perfect, he must exist. Now, if that just seems like a beautiful little argument, good, because it is a beautiful little argument. I'm not saying it's correct or sound, as we would now say sound, but it's a beautiful argument. We'll deal with that in meditation 5. So that's from the kind of, that's from the concept or idea of God itself, or self, we can infer the God, because it's really from, this is an argument from perfection. Because God is perfect, God must exist. Now, the cosmological argument is the causal argument, right? Basically, that's, you look at something that's existing and you say, how did it get here? It must have come here because it was created. Therefore, you need a creator, therefore God. Now, today we're going to see that this is an argument from creation. But interestingly, most cosmological arguments, the creation arguments, most cosmological arguments begin with the biggest fact of all, which is the existence of the entire universe. And that, they say, needs a pretty powerful creator. Descartes is cleverer than that. Why? Because the cosmological argument really only proves that there's a really powerful being. So I imagine, okay, imagine you've got God, and God can create the universe. Okay, what else could create the universe?
Like God, that's just as powerful, but not.
But somehow slightly deficient in some way, yeah?
Also, would it be kind of a forest project if you said that there was a universe, kind of?
Well,
Yeah.
good. So Descartes cannot prove the existence of God and the existence of the universe, because right now he doesn't have the universe. He's only got his own mind and thoughts. So that's closed off for Descartes anyways. But it's interesting that even if you could know that there was an existing physical world, according to Descartes, that wouldn't be enough to prove God's existence, because the existing world is still not perfect, right? Therefore, you could have a less than perfect being create a less than perfect world. That's what he thinks is possible. Now, that argument, he doesn't give it that way. He sort of assumes that you will believe that after you figured out his own proof. So he would say it's a weak starting point to try to move from this universe to God, because you could move just as easily from this universe to kind of God's younger brother or something. and you'd have not what you wanted, which was God. So that's why maybe he doesn't use that as the argument, but most philosophers have tried to move from there's a universe existing, what was responsible for that kind of creation of that universe? A God. And not just any old God, but the perfect God of various religions, and that's what is illegitimate. Teleological argument. This is the argument sometimes called the argument from design, right? That the universe is so incredibly intricate and well put together and functions so perfectly with all of its causal laws that it could only have been designed by an intelligent creator or intelligent designer, put it like that. Now, what could you say in response to the design argument that's very similar to what you could say in response to the cosmological argument? Josh, what could you say in response to the design argument?
They still wouldn't get you the kind of God needed to like prove the truth, because I mean you could have some like intelligent force that may contributed to it, but it's not the one that I think Descartes wants to get.
Good, exactly. So you could have a very, very, very intelligent, powerful being, but not quite God, that arranged for a very well-organized universe. And that's still not proving what you wanted, which was the existence of the God, the perfect being that you were after. So an imperfect being who's still very powerful could create an incredibly intricate universe, as intricate as our universe. And that still isn't perfection yet. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say, couldn't you point to imperfections in the universe and say, like,
Right.
This is evidence that our God is not perfect?
Right, you could. I mean, I've always said the fact that I have nipples is an interesting fact. Why? What part of the perfect design of the world is it that men have nipples? Seems silly. Totally redundant, useless. Doesn't that prove that whoever was doing the stuff really got it wrong there? Right? Or there wasn't anything intelligent doing the stuff, whichever it is, but like it seems to be, I know, disproof of God from men's nipples, it's too quick, right? But the idea is, it seems that there are things that are just not particularly working very well. Now, that one, therefore, is weak, and David Hume famously came along and said, all this proves is some intelligent being, at best, is behind it all. Now, evolutionary theory, of course, has something to say about why organisms are the way they are. In fact, evolutionary theory could do a good job of explaining my nipples. But the point is, right, much better than the other theories, right? But the point is, even evolutionary theory couldn't explain what? Yeah, Paul? Reason. Oh, maybe or maybe not. Actually, they think they can do a pretty good job of explaining the fact that I have reason. But maybe you think they can't guarantee the correctness of reasoning in the way that Descartes thinks they can. So maybe you're right. So yeah.
Wouldn't they have a problem explaining why, like, the ultimate cause? Like,
Well, what has to exist first before there can be? Yeah. The universe itself. So the planets, the stars, the gases, right? Evolutionary theory can't explain that. Number one. And what else can't evolutionary theory technically explain? So it can't explain the physical universe, right? But there's something else it can't explain when you think about it. What does evolutionary theory assume for the purposes of, Andrew, what does evolutionary theory assume to get going for the purposes of, species developing?
Well, what's going through my mind right now is that we talk about the distinction of having a mind or having a soul and whatnot, and evolutionary theory assumes that, we originally, our ancestors are animals and whatnot that we now consider to not have minds or souls that we do have.
Okay, very good. If you're confident of the existence of minds and or souls, and you think evolutionary theory has nothing to say about that, evolutionary theory has only things to say about bodies, living organisms, right? But what is it? You need physical, and yet?
Evolutionary theory can't explain why the process started in the first.
Right. So evolutionary can't explain why life began. Right? Think about it, right? It tells you how if you got life, you eventually developed these male creatures, but it doesn't tell you how the life itself began, right? So evolutionary works on things once you've got life. It doesn't explain the existence of life, nor does it explain the existence of the universe with its chemical constituents that was the basis for life. So it couldn't explain even all of that, which is a lot to explain. So even if you had a universe with no living organisms and no evolution, you could still ask, why did that universe come to be? Yeah?
Also, I mean, you have all the atoms and all the functionings of the universe.
Right.
But you can't really tell where that comes from. Like, where's the logic behind that?
Yes. So I'm
how-
assuming that when I say the universe in its physical form, I'm assuming that that's all law-governed, the interactions of planets and stars, all the way down to atoms, beyond that to quarks, beyond that to whatever it is, right? Whatever the theoretical physicists are working on these days, right? Evolutionary theory about life doesn't explain how that came to be and why it's so perfectly ordered if it's perfectly ordered. I don't know about the equivalent case in physics of really bad things happening, but presumably there are some things that we really worry about there too. But the fact of it all existing, quite apart from life, is something that would need an explainer. So even if you think that there's something to be explained that evolution theory doesn't give you, you can still ask the question that Hume asks, but this universe, as complex as it is physically, still isn't perfection. Or we don't know it to be perfection. Therefore, we could assume a less than perfect being created the physical universe. And maybe even a less than perfect being was able to create life. Okay, final argument, the moral argument. This is the one that's trickiest because this has the most assumptions of all. What this says is, there must be a God because evildoers must get punished. It can't be the case that, as it were, the people who do evil in this life don't go unpunished, because that would, as it were, undermine some of the motivation to be morally good. So, as it were, there must be, as it were, a kind of heaven and hell for there to be, as it were, for moral truths to be true. But we know moral truths to be true, so it must be that there's a heaven and a hell, or a God who at least is doing the punishing and the rewarding. So that, you might think, is the weakest argument of all, because that assumes so much. It assumes that for there to be morality, there must be a kind of a God watching over. But we're not going to consider that one in this course, because it's beyond the scope of the philosophers we looked at. We will mention Berkeley's argument when we get to Berkeley. What we're interested in for this part of the course is arguments 1 and 2. And today we're going to look at 2. Now, the reason why I've given you this little kind of introduction to the arguments is, in fact, Descartes' argument, if you accepted his premises, is probably the very best version of the cosmological. And therefore, it's not an accident that this argument, which is on the basis of perfection, is basically the best kind of argument, really. And this argument, the closer it gets to that argument, the more it gets to be a better argument. So what he wants to have as the example is basically an example of some existing perfection that requires a creator that is perfect for it to exist. So in a sense, perfection is what is generating, if these are going to be sound at all, what's helping generate soundness for these two arguments is something about perfection. So, remember how we said that Descartes in Meditation 2 doesn't have the existence of the world to rely upon, like the normal cosmological arguments have, because they don't doubt the existence of the world. Descartes doubts the existence of the world at this point. Really what he's saying is he should suspend judgment on the existence of the world. He doesn't really think there is no world, but he can't be certain of it. So what they started out with was the existence of the world. What has Descartes got at the beginning of Meditation 2? Well, he's got ideas or thoughts, right? And he's got the thing that thinks, right? Which is the mind or the soul. Right? That's what he's got to work with. Not Grand Canyon, but just a bunch of ideas or thoughts and a mind. And so can he, with those meager materials, as it were, prove the existence of God? And he thinks, yes, that's enough to prove the existence of God. Now you might think a soul is a pretty amazing thing, and it would take an amazing being to create a soul. Therefore, if their soul is existing, there must be some pretty powerful thing that created them. But in fact, he doesn't move from the soul to the creation by God. He moves from ideas to God being a creator. So it is actually from something that seems pretty weak that he shows that God exists. Okay, so let's talk about what he says about ideas. Now, ideas are not the same as thoughts. Remember how we said this at the beginning? Because I can have an idea, and it itself is not supposed to be true or false. Right? Remember that? So an idea might be just, for example, let's give examples. Horse. That's an idea. Maybe there are no horses, but I have the idea of a horse. Now, what else could I have an idea of? Well, now I have to ask you to, unfortunately, go into things like literature, maybe even, fantasy novels, Dungeons and Dragons, any of that sort of stuff. What could I have an idea of? That, yeah?
What about unicorns?
Unicorns. Okay, so I want something, right, that we think we have an idea of, even though we don't think there are any, right? Hippogriff. Reaching for that one, nobody took the bait, right? Giant.
Yes, that's where I was.
Giant. Okay, you're a giant. Dragon, right?
I was checking a bit.
Okay, right. Good. So anything that's like a fantastical creature that we don't think exists. Okay, now, I want something that's a little simpler, maybe, than that one, than horse. And that we don't think is mythical, like a unicorn. Can anybody give me something that's much less complex, yeah? Green, a color, right? Okay, good. So we have these ideas, and this is a simple idea. You can't really reduce green to something else. This is a complex idea. Horse is a mammal, various parts to it. Unicorn, various parts to it. We can't really talk about it being a mammal, magical, right? But the point is that we have different ideas, right? Now, what Descartes says, without yet giving an explanation as to why he's going there, he says, all of our ideas, no matter how complex, no matter how many there are, right, etc., etc., we can say about them all that they divide up into three types. Now, we can't at this point be certain that there are any that fulfill all the three, but we can be certain that they seem to come in three types. Okay, the types of ideas. And remember, we've not yet said anything about true or false. We've just said that they are different types. One is innate. Two is adventitious. And the third, I think, is translated as, is it fictional in the text? I think it's something like fictional. If it's not fictional, then it's something like made up. Okay, so here's the way it seems to him. There are certain things that are fictional. For example, unicorns, right? Or dragons, of course, dragons. There are Komodo dragons, we know that. We think those are made up, because we think they're made up of things that we actually have ideas of from experience. So what are unicorns? They're combinations, it seems, of certain animals with certain other animals, or certain animal parts with certain other animal parts, right? So if it's the narwhal, the whale with kind of horn on its head, plus a horse, plus I think it's got kind of cloven hooves, so that takes it from the goats. It's a combination of these three animals. So part of it then comes from horses. So we think that horses we have these ideas. Now, why do we think we have these ideas? Because of experience. So fictional ideas are made up, it seems, in part out of experience. But in addition to having ideas made up of experience, like green, what was from meditation 2, there was at least one idea that we said we had, which it seems did not come from our experiences of any kind. Ava, is there one idea we had from meditation 2, way back then, that didn't seem to come from our experience? Well, actually, that's a good question as to whether you think that your belief that you are thinking comes from an experience of thinking or not. I actually think people disagree as to whether that was an experience of thinking or not an experience of thinking. Some people think that thinking is an experience. But you might think the knowledge of not the thought itself, although you may still think that was an experience. What were we able to infer from the fact that there was thought? Liz, yeah? Of a God? No, we don't know yet that there is a God. We've imagined a God, but we don't know yet there is a God. Think of it a second, right? What did you show to exist in the world apart from thoughts last time here? I mean, Jackie, what did we show existed apart from thoughts in meditation 2? If thoughts exist, what must exist? Well, what am I when I say? Because remember, I'm not a living organism necessarily. Patrick? A thing that thinks. What was the name for a thing that thinks? Very quickly. Okay, fair enough. You got me. What's the other term for anything that ever thinks? We've a name for that sort of a thing. We've got bodies and we've got souls or minds. So we have the idea of a mind, which technically we don't have. We have thoughts and their experiences perhaps, but we don't technically experience minds. But you might think, oh, but wait a second, I experience my own mind because I have thoughts, right? So maybe you think that's an experience. But if you think that's an experience, let's be absolutely clear. There's something that you have an idea of that you didn't get from having an experience of that. What is the thing that you have an idea of that you didn't have an idea of from the experience of that? Let's see. Other Andrew, isn't it? Yeah. Last time we said that when I was looking at the honey, right, which had the color of golden, which had that aroma of sweet honey, which melted when you got it near fire, right? They were all a bunch of ideas, right? But what did I say I could arrive at, even if it was just an idea, and I didn't know if it was actually true or not, or existed or not? What could I have an idea of? Well, okay, Jeff, what are the name for the things that have extension? What are the name for things that have extension? What do we call them? Not minds. No, substances both. Mind or, yeah, bodies. So I have an idea of body. Now here's what's clear. At this point in the meditations, Descartes can say he has an experience of a body. If you're dreaming, you have experiences, but you can't say they're experiences of a body, because there might be no body, and you're still having experiences. But you can have an idea of a body. And the idea of a body, right, isn't the idea of an extended thing in at least 3 dimensions, right? Takes up space, whatever. So even if there aren't any bodies, you have an idea of a body. So guess what? Body, as such, is an innate idea. You don't get it from experience of any kind, in the sense that you might have experiences, quote unquote, that are given to you by an evil demon or by a god that's deceiving, and still you can have the idea. But if you have the idea, you did not get it from experience. Yeah, good, Hannah.
So your soul doesn't go in that category as well, because you think you might have experienced it from the soul.
Well, there technically is a debate. Should you say that you've had experiences of your soul because you've had thoughts? Or should you say that since you've had experience of thoughts, you have an idea of a thing that has thoughts? So it's open to really. Some people think experience has to do with kind of the senses. And you don't know that you have thoughts from your senses. You know that you have thoughts from your thoughts, right? So is that an experience when it's just the pure thought and thinking about the fact that you have thought? Do you reason that you have a soul because you have thoughts? Or do you experience your soul because you experience thoughts? There's actually an open question about that. Some philosophers think that every thought has a kind of qualitative feeling about it. So even if I just think 2 plus 3 equals 5, that's an experience. I don't know if you think that's an experience, but some people, that's an experience. So if that's an experience, then you experience your thoughts, and maybe you would say, I experience my soul. I don't think that I experience my soul, though. That's my own view. Even if I experience my thoughts, I don't experience my soul. Should I have a soul? So I want to put soul in there, or mind in there as well. But there is this question. Yeah, Jeremy.
What about like a baby that doesn't yet realize that it has a body that other people can see, or that it's
Good.
separate from its surroundings?
Okay, good. Now, Descartes has the following problem. He has to say that babies have all these ideas, but they just aren't yet fully aware of their ideas because they're being so bombarded with sense ideas that they're kind of blocked. It's like sensory kind of overload, in one sense, as a baby without being able to sort them all out. So what he would say about a baby is it has innately the idea of body and soul, but it's so bombarded with sensory overload that it waits until it's like older or teenager or adult before it can sort out its own ideas, including the idea of its having a soul or being a soul, and its having or being combined with the body. So 2 things. The baby can have thoughts, it seems, and not know the bigger thought. So you can have the sort of the color thoughts without being conscious or aware of this other idea. But strictly speaking, it's there. Now you, of course, could insist, well, what does it mean to say that I have an idea that I'm not aware of? Right? I mean, that's kind of not very, very nice. I mean, right now I want an idea of, eating ice cream, but, or maybe there's an ice cream that I haven't tried yet. There's a movie I haven't seen yet. I haven't seen, 12 Years a Slave. And, but you have the idea of that. You're just not aware of it. No, that's no use. I want to have the awareness as well as the idea. Well, you might think, what use is it to say that the baby has an idea of a mind or an idea of a body and no awareness of it? And Descartes simply says, for his own argument to go through, that has to be something that you have in advance. Now here's what he would say, although the psychologists in the room are going to scream. He would say, if a baby can eventually decide that this same body got spray painted green from when it was blue, and got flattened from when it was tall, and went from solid to liquid when it was melted, if the baby can follow it through all those changes, then the baby has an idea of body behind it all that it couldn't get from the experiences of seeing the flattening, the coloring, the melting. And that's why he would say, that proves that babies have ideas of bodies, or children, I suppose, when the baby develops a bit, because you have to be at least a child of a certain age to have the idea that it's the same thing through all those changes. If the baby, or the child now, has the understanding that it's the same thing going through changes, then it can't get that from experience, it must have that already. And that's what he would say. Now the psychologist in the room will say, crazy idea, but that's what Descartes holds. So, in other words, you need mind and body ideas to make sense of experience at all. That's what he really wants to say. Those ideas have to come first. It's the same body undergoing changes in all its outward shapes and colors and smells. That very idea that there's something constant through all that change is something that experience doesn't give you. Experience just gives you change, not something constant behind change. So that would be why he would claim it's innate. Now, right now, what's really important is whether you agree that there are any innate ideas or any adventitious ideas or any fiction ideas, you understand the difference in meaning between these two. This is experience, basically, right? But you might think, but there are components to it, like the fact that it's a body that come from, that are innate. This is basically still experience, really, when you think about it, right? Because all you do is kind of recycle the things from experience. So this is actually experience too. It's just that what you are doing is, there's experience, and that's working with your imagination. Okay? So your imagination goes to work on the things from experience, and experience itself gives you adventitious ideas. Now, one of the things he says about adventitious ideas is you don't really have control over your current experiences. So if right now you're experiencing things You don't have control over that. You do have control over your imagination. You can imagine things different from the way things are. Right? So I can't not experience this chair if I walk that way. But I can imagine being able to walk through that chair. Right? That's what I suppose every time you watch a science fiction movie in which, you know, the mutants can walk through walls, you're just imagining that. Okay, now, if it's the case that we have something that's innate, one thing is actually, in a sense, assumed, I suppose. Maybe not assumed, it's just wrong. And that is, we have to have an origin for that idea. So if the cause of adventitious ideas, if we've proven that they are adventitious, if the cause of that is established, the cause will be something like the external world, the physical world. But for these guys, since there's no experience that gives you those, you still apparently need a cause for those things. And so in the end, what you're going to have are what caused me to have innate ideas. Okay, now there's one more innate idea that he says he finds when he looks around inside his mind. Or looks around inside the contents of his mind, looks around his thought. What's the other idea that he has that's the biggest idea of all? Scott, what's the biggest idea of all? God. So now he has to add to his list of ideas God. Now where's it going to go? Well, have you had an experience of God? He says, no. Therefore, it doesn't seem to be able to go there. Did you make it up? Well, if you made it up, you had to make it up from things that you experienced. But what is the idea of God? It's the idea of some kind of perfect being. But if it's a perfect being, does it have a body? No. It's a perfect mind. Where does your idea of mind come from? Not from experience. No. So if you have an idea of God, it must be innate. Right? Because God, the idea of God is the idea of a perfect mind or a perfect soul with all perfections that minds or souls can have. So it must be all-knowing, must be all-powerful, right? Because we think of souls as having power. Bodies are kind of like a bit dumb and inert, right? But souls, they move things around, right? So now we say, okay, this is the really interesting one. Because remember, unlike the cosmological argument, which had the universe was just a body, a gigantic body. But no matter how gigantic bodies are, they're not quite as good as these things. These things are the really cool things in the universe, the minds or the souls. And now we've got an idea of the superversion. The superversion is God. So what we're actually trying to prove, in a sense, is what could have created that? Now imagine that you didn't have the universe to show, to sort of move from. What would be even better than having the universe to show a creator for? What would be the best existing thing to prove that God existed? God. So if you had God, that would be pretty amazing. Because then you had to show right, that God is the only creator of God, right? And that wouldn't be subject to all those weaknesses and deficiencies of those other attempts, right? If you had God's existence, could the universe create God? No way. Are you kidding me? So that would be the best thing to have. Now we don't have that yet because, of course, you can't assume that God exists in order to show that God exists. So we don't get that. But what we have here is the best thing that we can possibly have, which is the idea of God. That's something that we do have that does exist. Now, Descartes' point by saying that these are ideas and not thoughts is we can have ideas even if what? Even if, what's true about these ones when I say about the unicorn or, let's see. Right, so I can have ideas of things that don't exist. So I haven't assumed that God exists by saying that I have an idea of God, because I have an idea of unicorns too, and it would be crazy for somebody to assume that because I said I have an idea of unicorn, I believe unicorns exist or I know unicorns exist. No, I don't believe unicorns exist, but I have an idea of them. So, just because I have an idea of something does not mean that I've assumed its existence. Therefore, I'm not begging the question against myself at this point. I'm not sort of reasoning in a circle. All I've said is that I have an idea of God, not that I've got God yet. Okay, so now I have an idea of God. So now I want to see, okay, let's look at these ideas again. Now, another one I didn't give here, which is on the list here, is I didn't give as an idea of, I mentioned it was green, right? So happy that I'm working with a great color like green. Green's a great color for various reasons. You know, that's right. Okay. So, right. So, if it's the case that I've got green and I've got horse, importantly, these are different from each other. Why? Well, oh, I guess, is that? Yeah. Okay. So, green, yeah.
What makes green different from body in terms of like just being able to like kind of conceive it immediately? Like I'm not really seeing like we talk about things with extension.
Right.
What makes you able to like come up with that idea immediately as opposed to green?
Well, here's what he says. When you experience, say, a green, let's take a tree, because a tree is at least normally green, right? Here's what he thinks is going on, right? What you experience when you know, now let's assume for the sake of the argument that we've got bodies at sea, but it's not really important today because you could dream a tree, right? What you see is the color, so that's green. And what you, I guess, experience is the tree shape, right? Right? And of course, if you get close enough and you smell it, the pine sap or whatever it is, right? And those, he says, are all experiential. But what you don't technically ever see is the body itself that, as it were, has that shape. So Descartes thinks there's a difference between the body itself and the shape and color and smell of the body. Because every single one of these could change. It could lose its green color, you know, I suppose deciduous or just kind of dying. It could change shape. It could have a lightning struck it, bend in half, right? It could go through all those changes, and apparently Descartes wants to say, we have an understanding of its being a physical body that's distinct from the actual shape it has at any point in time, or the smell, or the color. Now, you might think, but if I didn't have those experiences, I wouldn't ever infer, as it were, behind it all, that there's this body, the tree, or the body. But he says, no, you actually do infer that behind it all is a body. And that's why, if you have a hologram of a tree, which looks exactly the same as the tree, right, the hologram tree, then you would still say there's no tree there in the hologram case. Maybe it's a very complex hologram that has smells and everything like that. But there's still no actual tree there, whereas there's an actual tree in the normal experiential case. So his claim is that you literally experience, like with the hologram, you experience the shape, the color, the smell, but you don't experience the tree behind it all, in some sense. Now, you might think it's a bit of a stretch to say that we do know there's a tree behind it all. But he says, yeah, you believe. Put it like this. Maybe this is going to be something that, if you do Merleau-Ponty, if I put this chair up in front of you, there's a part of this chair that right now you can't see, right? Because you've got a certain angle on it. I can see it from behind. I can't see what you're seeing in the front. You can't. But you fill in the background, right? You fill in that it's three-dimensional. And not that I just presented you with a two-dimensional hologram. You're filling in the rest of it. It is technically beyond what you're able to see. You're kind of projecting into that chair the depth and the solidity or whatever it is, right? What's behind the colors and the shape. So you're actually adding to what you experience by saying there's a three-dimensional chair there, not just a two-dimensional image of a chair. And that filling in the extra stuff is what your mind does here, because it fills in the bodiness that's, as it were, supporting all those ideas. That's his claim. Now, I'm not endorsing this as an argument. That's what he holds you think. He thinks you think this, not just you think this, even though you may not be able to articulate it until you read Descartes. That's what you think. Yes, Steph Sanders.
So you can't experience like the substance behind it?
You actually cannot experience the substance
you can believe
behind it.
You know that it's there.
Oh, more than just you know that there must be a substance that's supporting all those ideas. or all those colors, or all those. There can't be this stuff and nothing behind it. The hologram is only possible, as it were, in virtue of there being things that aren't holograms, or a super deceiving demon or a super deceiving god. But here's what's interesting. Let's say the whole thing is a hologram. What can I infer is that I still have the idea of a body, it's just that there are none. Bodies are like unicorns. But right now he's not trying to prove the existence of bodies, just the idea of a body is not something from experience. The idea of a body is something innate. You could get false innate ideas in some sense, although God in the end wouldn't do that because God's good. But the point is right now that you could have ideas of bodies even if there weren't bodies. Therefore, the idea of a body is separate from experience of bodies. It's an actual idea. Even if there's no experience of bodies, you have an idea of a body behind the ideas of experience. Even if there are none, that's what you have as an idea separate from those experiential sense ideas. So you have a non-sense idea of a body that's distinct from your sense ideas of colors and shapes. And as it were, this might not exist, but you still have an idea of it. So, you didn't have it from experience. Where did it come from? Well, if it doesn't come from experience, he's going to say it must come from something bigger than experience, a demon or a god. But now, we want to move not from the body idea, we want to take the God idea. Now, here is where the argument becomes really fascinating. Because what he wants to say is, of course, and you know this, that ideas like, ideas divide up into having two kinds of, there are two ways to think about ideas. One is in terms of formal reality. And that just means, basically, that they exist rather than they don't. So formal reality is what we would just call reality or existing. That they exist. If you want to say what it would mean in most people, it's like psychological reality. Or psychological existence. How about that? The fact that I'm having the idea right now of this classroom means that the idea has that much existence. The formal reality, if I'm not thinking of the classroom, then there's no formal reality to the thought of this classroom, because I'm not having that thought. If nobody is having the thought of, I suppose, the chapel at 4 a.m. last night, then the idea of the chapel at 4 a.m. last night has no formal reality. Right? If right now somebody's thinking about the chapel, they're thinking of the chapel that has formal reality. So it's just existing, normally. But of course, that's not the only way that we can think about ideas. The other way we can think about ideas is what we call objective reality. Now, objective reality is a terrible term. It's a really horrible word. But what it means is, in some sense, the contents of the idea, right? The representational content. So what he wants to say is that different ideas have different contents, right? And if we go back to the green and the horse and God, we're going to explain all these now in a certain kind of way. So, formal reality of ideas. Well, ideas are pretty limited, because ideas have only the barest kind of existence. Ideas only have psychological reality. So they are the lowest on the food chain of existence. So existence or reality, right, divides up into different kinds of existence, or degrees of existence, or degrees of reality. Now, Descartes also says that these are degrees of perfection, but we'll get to that part. So on the lowest level, you have property. And that would be, e.g., green, right? So a color, smell, shape, those sorts of things. They're the lowest. Why? Because in order for a property to exist, what must exist as well? If a property exists, what must be existing care? What must exist if a property of color exists? If it exists, now forget about me for a second. If it exists, what must be true? If the color green exists, And forget about human beings. Just if the color green is, what must be true? What must exist? Oh, yeah. If green exists, green must exist. Right? That's absolutely correct thing to say. Hannah, yeah?
The idea.
Actually, no, because I've imagined for the second that there's nobody around. Yeah, Jerry?
Green thing.
Green things. So things that have the property green. So what are the sorts of things that are properties of colors? Bodies, because minds don't have colors. They have ideas of colors, but they don't have any colors. So greenness, or the color green existing, requires the existence of a body. Why? Because green cannot exist on its own. Green is dependent on the existence of something to have it. Now, the idea of green is also a property. But what does the idea of green require for its existence? Yeah? A mind to have the idea. So, ideas are properties, and colors and shapes, and they're all properties. So they require the existence of substance. Now, I said before, substance comes in two kinds, right? Mind or body. So every idea requires the existence of a mind. That was a substance theory from meditation too. Every, as it were, body property, which obviously the way I put it now seems a tautology, requires the existence of a body. Now you could have no green existing and only ideas of green, but then you still have to have a mind. So properties are always dependent upon the existence of at least substances of some kind. Yeah? Yeah.
Could you have the idea of green without green actually existing?
Yes. According to Descartes, crazy thought, but yeah. If there was no physical universe with no bodies having the qualities of green or blue or red, then there could still be a demon or a god giving you ideas of green and blue or red. Therefore, yeah, you could have ideas of colors and there'll be no colors. You can have ideas of bodies and there are no bodies. All possible. You can have ideas of demons and there are no demons. Right? Demons are like unicorns. So now we want to ask, okay, is that it? Is that as far as it goes? Well, no. Because what do bodies require? Well, maybe you think this is a bit unfair because it's going too far already. But he thinks that bodies and minds require something else. What do they require for their existence? Yeah?
Does they require like a cause?
Yes, to keep them in existence and to give rise to them in the very first place. They require something that... So what is it that is responsible for the existence... Heon, what's responsible for the existence of bodies or minds? God. So you need an infinite substance, apparently. Now, even if you don't believe that as a causal story, let's put it like this. God is the idea of a being that doesn't need any other being for its own existence. It's sort of top of the heap, end of the line. Right? That's what the idea of God is. So everything else is dependent upon God. God isn't dependent upon anything else. God is completely independent of all things. Now, that's basically degrees of formal reality. Now, we don't yet know what exists. We just have ideas of rankings of formal reality. So let's go back to this here. Remember, I've got formal reality, I've got objective reality. Now, my ideas are basically just, I can sort of just draw a sort of a side column and say, okay, if I were to stop talking about existing things, right, I can move over to talking about ideas of those. Now this is where people, let's be clear, I can have the idea of an idea. That's important. I can have an idea. I can have the idea of an idea. I said to you, what's an idea? Oh, an idea is you have an idea of an idea, right? Always possible. Okay, so I can now talk about, if this is the formal reality, actually, yeah, maybe it's better to put the formal reality as a column. Now I can move into what's called objective reality, which is basically, if I'm only talking about the ideas, I can say idea of God, idea of mind, idea of body, idea of green, an idea of green. Now, what I'm interested in here is the following. These are the simplest things that exist, properties. They're very, very, very basic. And the idea of green is a basic idea. It's just a very simple idea. If I imagine the idea of body, that's a more complex idea. And if I had examples of bodies, like horses or race cars, those are pretty complex body ideas. In fact, if I have the example of the idea of the universe, that's an amazingly complex idea. All of science is devoted to figuring out that idea. That's a pretty enormous idea. The idea of mind, again, a pretty big idea. So this idea is way more complex than that idea. Green, easy. Mind, really complex and difficult and hard. Lots of stuff to it. Okay. Now, move to this one. And according to Descartes, that is the most complex idea of all. That is super, super complex, that idea. Because it's the idea of infinity. And nothing gets you infinity that's finite. You can only understand the finite, limits, endings, if you understand unending, infinite, without limits. Human beings have the ability to understand where something ends because they have the knowledge of going beyond that. But nothing in experience is infinite. Nothing in experience, or eternal. Nothing in experience is eternal, but we have an understanding of eternal. And he says that comes before our understanding of temporal or finite. Yeah?
So he's saying that you can't experience God?
No, he's saying, well, actually, depends. You might say he's saying you can't experience God in the sense of have some kind of an encounter. But the reason why you can't have an encounter with God is that experience is by its very nature a limited sort of thing. You can't experience the infinite. That would not be possible. Because experience is kind of a finite encounter with infinite. That's not even possible. But that's not a limitation on the infiniteness of God, that you can't have a finite version of experiencing God. Yeah?
So is it next step to say that because of our human limitations, that this very complex idea of God must come from God?
Well, yes, basically. This is such an idea outside of experience, or even outside of that it's the idea of infinite perfection. The idea of infinite perfection, we have it. But that is incontestable for him. You have the idea of infinite perfection, whether you think you have it or not. You do. And if you don't think you have it, then you just haven't been thinking clearly enough. And since you have it, it exists. But since it exists, like everything else, it needs a cause. So what's the only possible cause of an idea which has that much objective reality? It's so much objective reality, it's hard to even talk about. What's the only possible cause of that much objective reality of an idea? That big of an idea? The only possible cause of it is God. God's the only source possible of the idea of God. These ideas, God can create too. But that's easy. That's child's play to God to create the idea of a body. He can do that without even trying, right? And God can create the idea of ideas of green, because there might be no green, there might be no bodies, there might just be nothing, and God creates it all. But creating the idea of God, that actually requires God. Nothing less than God can do that. So the claim is, this is an effect, literally an effect that requires a cause. And it's a super effect. It's the most amazing effect in existence. The idea of God is the most amazing thing in existence, apart from God himself. Right? It's even more amazing than you. Your idea of God is far more amazing than you are. Therefore, it could only have been caused by the most amazing thing of all, which is God. So this is an effect, and this is the cause. Now, you might think, wait a minute. Is that really sound? Okay, so let me give you the analogy, and I'll have to stop there. The analogy would be this. And I actually wanted to play a clip from a movie, but I might have to do that Tuesday. Imagine that you woke up tomorrow morning and you understood completely and totally in all respects how it is that there is life. And last night you went to bed not knowing that. What would be the possible causes for your knowing in the morning what you didn't know the previous night? You might say, well, my mind could have been working kind of autopilot. But it's a pretty amazing kind of autopilot that generates an understanding of how life came into existence, right? Or let's say you woke up tomorrow morning and suddenly you understood, I know, what you think is right now very difficult to understand. Well, Anthony can think it's very difficult to understand. If you woke up tomorrow morning and you suddenly understood it, you think, wow, how did that come to me? Okay, let's go further. Let's say tomorrow you woke up and you understood the entire universe. Everything in it. That would be pretty amazing, right? Scott, yeah?
What if you just already understood it?
Okay, so maybe you think, I just finally figured it out what I already knew. But now imagine you wake up tomorrow morning and you know how to build a spaceship that travels through time. Right? Here's what we don't think. It just came to me. You don't think that. So, you just, idea of God just kind of came to me. No. If it's that amazing an idea, it didn't just come to you. You weren't given it. Okay, now that's not a proof, but I'm going to start with that next time. I'll read what you guys wrote and see how it goes. Okay, I have to hand back things. Please come up and get them because I can't go all the way up. So Jackie, Esther, this is the end of class formally, but I'm going to have to hand these out. Jackie, Ava, Paul, Scott, Poseidon, Josh, Ava, Jonathan, Dion, Farah, Howell, Hope, oh yes, I know Hope is out. Kara, Andrew Lamb, Andrew. Hannah, Austin, Austin, Patrick Barry, other Andrew Head, Steph, Will, there we go. Will. Patrick Robertson, they were Patrick. Yes. Patrick Barry, okay, and if you have, I think I said to the Dropbox, if somebody did physical printouts, just leave them there, but I'll work with them anyways. I'll try to have them all be electronic next time, but we're doing my best. Okay, good.